Let's see, when I was a young man, I lived in Florida for, I think it was about off and on for a decade. So I was working down in Florida. I had moved there from North Carolina as a boy. I was working in Florida. This was in the 90s. So I'm telling this story because it's a 90s story. And I believe, I believe people like stories from the 90s because it was a different time. The 1990s, the 1990s, this country was like going through a renaissance, kind of like what it's going through now. So it was kind of a better time. Of course, we did not have all the surveillance that we have now in the 90s. Everything wasn't chronologically logged and categorized for nefarious purposes, but it was still a good time to be alive. So in the 90s, I was working in Florida. I worked primarily at in a lot of restaurants. Went back and forth from like Daytona Beach to Jacksonville, Florida, St. Augustine, Florida, Orlando. Orlando's where Disney World's at, if nobody knows. Kind of a cool place. Epcot Center, Disney World, MGM Studios. Orlando's a cool place. I like Orlando, but it's very all of Florida's kind of very touristy, in my opinion. So I didn't want to reside there permanently. But the point is, I worked at restaurants for 2 decades of my life consecutively. Just whatever I could do, washing dishes, prepping food, line cook, chef. I eventually worked my way up to a chef title. But in Florida, the workers' situation for people working in Florida in the 90s was not very good. I don't think it probably still is. I don't know if things have changed much, but the problem with the workers' union in Florida was there was really no workers' compensation for people who got injured, right? Here's a really good story. When I first started working at this one restaurant called Scarlett O'Hara's, named after the movie Gone with the Wind, it's kind of a theatrical themed restaurant called Scarlett O'Hara's. There was this one guy that worked there named Kent. He was older. He was about my age, and I was like a teenager. And I worked underneath this guy, and he had a meat slicer fall on him. A meat slicer. If you don't know what a meat slicer is, hello, how are you doing, Mr. Xbox Man? So this guy, when I started working at this restaurant, right, half of his skeleton had been crushed from a meat slicer. Meat slicer is like a good 200-pound piece of metal. You put your ham or your roast beef on there, and they have them at Subway foods, Subway sandwiches. They have to slice meat in order to make sandwiches, most restaurants. So that's what a meat slicer is, a big hunk of metal with a big giant razor on it, a cyclic circle, and you put the meat on there and you slice it up. This guy that I started working under, as soon as I worked at this restaurant, had a meat slicer fall, just missed his head, caught him on the shoulder, right, and just horribly disfigured him, right? And the hospital really didn't even help him that much. They just kind of patched him up. The point is, right, like, he had to go back to work, right? This guy had a meat slicer fall on him in his 40s. He was in his 50s by the time I met him. This is a story from Florida, right? And what the workers' union had to say to him at the time was, well, you better go back to work or you're going to starve to death. It's a true story. So I started working there. I'm like, so if I get like really badly hurt here, they're just going to send me back to work. And they're like, yep, that's how that works. This is Florida. And here's where I'm going with this, right? I moved to Washington State in the late 90s, right? So I'm currently out here right now. I'm in Oregon State, but I've gone back and forth from Washington and Oregon for decades. Ooh, I'm back. Amazing. So Washington has a workers' union thing called Labor and Industries, right? I'd They take it out of your paycheck, and wherever you work, you'll get your FICA stuff taken out of your check, your income tax, and then one of the things you'll see is workers' compensation anytime you get a pay stub. So Washington just had like a workers' compensation plan. I'm sorry, Florida just had a workers' compensation plan, like most states. But Washington has something called labor and industries. When I first moved to Washington, there were guys that I was working with and that I met. This is a long time ago in the 90s. That were actually getting compensated for being hurt on the job. Let me say that again, because this is kind of important. There were guys retiring for getting what they paid into the system back. It was coming back to them like it's supposed to. We're all told there is actually real workers' compensation. This is why they take it out of your paycheck. In the state of Washington, when I first moved there, I lived next to a guy named Steve who was getting around like $84,000 for having his leg and his hip crushed on the job at a construction site. I felt bad for the guy who was in a wheelchair, but he was actually going to be able to get a house for getting hurt on the job. When they first told me this story, I was a teenager at the time. I thought that they were pulling my leg. I thought that they were joking with me. I was like, I just came here from the state of Florida. They have workers' compensation there. And a guy I worked with for a decade had a meat slicer fall on him. A meat slicer crushed his skeleton, horribly disfigured. They sent the guy back to work. And when I left the state, I don't think he was going to court to get his workers' compensation. I don't think he ever received it because he passed away in the early 2000s during the Bush administration. But this guy, Steve, in Washington, when I moved there, really got around $100,000 settlement for being hurt on the job. And I was like, okay, well, this is a rare, isolated event, right? Like, this guy was just lucky. But in the state of Washington, people were really getting compensated for getting hurt on the job. And this was in the early 2000s when I found out about this. And so that's a thing. In the state of Washington and other states like that have a strong workers' labor union, labor and industries is what it's called in Washington. If you work hard and long enough and you pay into the system and you get hurt, you could actually be compensated. To this day, that's a true thing. That's why I moved to the state of Washington in the early 2000s and proceeded to work there. It's an interesting story, right? Of course, I guess I should be completely transparent with you guys. Hi, Clint. Your car's extended warranty. That's great. That's good, Clint. Yeah, those pesky people with the car extended warranty programs in the email system, right? But yeah, there are states that will compensate you for getting hurt on the job. But you have to kind of network out and talk to people. I'm not slandering the state of Florida. The story's decades old, but Florida did not have a good program, suffice to say. Like I said, when I left the state of Florida decades ago, there were people still going to court and fighting for their lives to get what they paid into the system back for being horribly disfigured and crushed by heavy machinery. And in the state of Washington, people were actually being compensated in the early 2000s. Now, as to the state of labor and industries in 2025 in the state of Washington, I'm being told, and I have been told, it's kind of gone downhill. So I'm being completely transparent with you guys. I'm not trying to tell you that if you live in the state of Washington and you get mangled and mauled by heavy machinery and you're limping around or you're in a wheelchair, that you're definitely going to be compensated. I'm not trying to tell you that. It's wishy-washy now. But that actually was a thing, and still is a thing that you can look into. States that have stronger workers' unions, you pay into workers' compensation no matter what you do. There is no job you'll get where your pay stub will not have a heavy chunk taken out of it by the state for workers' comp. In Washington, it's not called the workers' compensation program. It's called labor and industries. Anyways, fun little facts. You guys praying to God, man. That's what I do religiously. Jesus loves you. I'm out.